Hello everyone. My name is Bruno. I'm a QA manager at NetGuru, and today I would like to talk about the crimes against testability. And if there are any crimes to be committed against testability, then you might be asking, have I committed at least some of those? Yes, I am guilty as charged. I have committed at least some of those. And the key thing I would like to share is that it's okay to make mistakes unless you learn from them, right? So you do not repeat the same mistakes over and over again, and you adapt to new current circumstances. And that's what I would like to do today, to share my story, a story how I learned about testability and what have I learned. Testability, meaning the ability to test, or how maybe Goiko phrased it on the recent talk, is to reduce the friction of testing. The assumption is if we have higher testability, then testing is easier and we can find defects quickly in a cheaper way, and in the end we can produce better software. The first thing when I started working as a QA, I got hired as a QA intern, and I knew nothing about how software works, how testing works, and I had to learn a lot. So I sat down, I started studying how web browsers work, how Jira works, how to raise a proper defect. The assumption is I had to learn everything from scratch. And that's what we call subjective testability, meaning for me personally, in a given project, it was very hard to test at first. But once I learned, the testability increased higher and higher. And it never ends. Up to this point, today, I think that testing mobile apps is much harder, at least for me, than testing of the web application. And it's simply because I have much more experience in testing web applications, meaning subjective thing seems to be pretty important. The second thing, going back to my story, the first application I was testing consisted of 3 steps, 3 various pages you had to take a look at. The first one was an initial form where you provided some data to the application, like your name, surname, home address, and so on and so on. Later on, you were redirected to some dynamic page where you were presented with various options to be selected, and you were shown the price depending on which options had been selected. And the third and final step was final payment, meaning you actually provide the card details and later on you pay for the product you have chosen. And everything was fine up until the point I was testing only the first step, meaning drop-downs, text inputs, captcha, stuff like that. But when we progressed to the development of the second or third step, then all the time I was doing something like this. I was filling in the form pretty quickly, only with my keyboard. I learned how to access the form using my keyboard only to speed up my tests. Of course, in the meantime, I learned that it's also kind of accessibility feature, so if I encountered any form items that weren't accessible by keyboard, I raised those as accessibility issues. But for me, those were mostly testability issues. And I was testing, and then a fellow colleague of mine from the development team sat down with me, and he had a laugh. He saw how funny it is. You might be asking, well, Bruno, you're standing here, why haven't you used any automation? Why haven't you used any browser plugins like form fillers, some stuff like that? And it was simply because I didn't know such a thing actually exists. And the colleague of mine told me, well, you can use JavaScript and you can save it as a bookmarklet, meaning as a bookmark over there. And I learned how to speed up my tests. He taught me I can submit my form with one click only, meaning in 1 second only. That was a huge breakthrough for me because it has speed up my tests enormously. And that's what we call project-related testability. Nothing magical happened there, right? It's neither me or the developer inventing like new stuff. It's just 2 people sharing their experiences, sharing their knowledge, right? And that's the key thing. The team needs to collaborate. Of course, in the project-related testability, we have much more things like change control, meaning change your application in a controlled manner. Do not change the core feature at random. Information availability, you need to share all the relevant information with the whole team. We have also the tool availability, meaning the team needs to have access to all the relevant tools there are. Test item availability, I assume if you're supposed to test something, you need to have it available for you. Of course, sandboxing, meaning sometimes it might be good to test on production, like Goiko is probably telling right now, but maybe not everything. It would be bad if you would worry all the time that you have this real user data that you don't have, you cannot break, right? You cannot be refrained in the tests you are planning, right? Because you won't execute all the relevant tests if you are not free to break the application you are working on. And there is, of course, some time pressure is fine, but maybe not too much. The next point I would like to talk about is when I learned about the user story called OG image, and I was like, oh my god, what's that? I didn't know what it is. And the developer told me, well, you need to take a look at the HTML, there's a tag called OG image, and you need to verify if the image path is correct. And I just did like that. But then I thought to myself, well, maybe there's something more in that. Why do we need this thing in HTML? And of course, that's how I learned that it's actually this image used later on Facebook or Twitter or any other social media. That's how you tell to the social media, that's the image I want to share. And if I didn't do that, I wouldn't execute all the relevant tests there are. Meaning, once again, I would only refrain myself. And that's what we call value-related testability, meaning do you understand the value that a particular user story or a particular piece of software you are working on brings to the client and in the end to the users that will be using your software. And it's, once again, not something magical, right? I did just a quick Google search what that is and I learned. I wasn't refraining myself just to verification of the acceptance criteria in the ticket. I wasn't basing my tests only on the ticket. I tried to look at the overall picture. It would be just like as if you would describe a house as a set of construction materials assembled according to house design patterns. That's an example by Kankaner James Bach. And of course, it doesn't tell us anything about what house actually is. It's much better to phrase it this way: a house is something built for people to live in. You immediately understand why we want to build a house. And once again, you are listening to me and you might be asking to yourself, well, this Bruno guy is speaking about this soft, fluffy stuff, and what about the code? When I think about testability, all I think about is code. And that's what we call intrinsic testability. And of course, there won't be high testability without the code itself. So the code is very important, and that's how we differentiate between the intrinsic and extrinsic testability, meaning the context of the application and the application itself. To give you an example, the application I was telling you about, so the application with the 3 steps, I learned there's such a thing as logs. I could preview the logging feature, see how the applications work behind the hood. And once I learned that, I tried to look at those. I tried to access the logs. But what happened? I got a 401 error. I wasn't authorized to view those, right? And that's a perfect example that shows us that we can have perfect piece of software that's highly testable and written in a perfect manner with a perfect code, but without this project-related testability, we can fail. We would not have highly testable application. So that's why I still think that extrinsic testability is highly important. And of course, if you would like to have some good testable codes, then those are the keywords you would like to explore with your developers, like high cohesion, loose coupling, low redundancy, and encapsulations. And of course, there are simple concepts to be understood, however, much harder to be applied in practice. But I think that's a topic for a separate presentation, or at least not for a lightning talk. And if we're speaking about the code then another thing I would like to highlight is automatability, meaning is your application easy to be automated? And I would like to differentiate between those. So highly testable application, it's not necessarily an application that's easy to be automated. And we sometimes might confuse those two things and focus solely on automation. To give you an example, maybe the most simple one about automatability, you might have the application that's in which once writing test automation, you could select various elements by IDs or maybe some specific classes or test data attributes, meaning some items that are later easy to maintain once you have a bigger and bigger automation framework, rather than using those long, elaborate XPaths that probably will fail and be harder to be maintained in the longer term. And right now you might be like, well, there's a lot of things to be considered, I cannot do them all at once. And I would like to share this quote, leave things better than you found them. That's a Boy Scout rule, so that's a rule that Boy Scouts follow. And it's invented by Robert Baden-Powell, the guy who set up the Boy Scouts organization in the United Kingdom. And it was referred to the camping, meaning when the Boy Scouts went out camping, they were told to leave the campsite much cleaner than they have fast met it. And we can apply it to the coding and automation as well. Maybe not necessarily refactor the whole code base at once. Start with small things. And eventually, small things will add up. And eventually, maybe a colleague of yours will try to follow the same rule, and he will try to add this small change in his feature. I tried it in my project, and what I learned is it actually works. And the last item about testability I would like to talk about is epistemic testability, meaning also sometimes called the risk gap, so the gap between what we already know and what we want to know about the software we are actually testing. So, for example, if we follow an iterative approach to testing, we learn much more, so we have more knowledge at the end of development and there are less tests to be executed. In the other scenario, we would defer our testing to the last phase and then the epistemic gap would be much, much bigger. But on the other hand, we can have different quality standards, right? So, of course, if we are testing life-critical scenarios, life-critical software, then we must execute much, much more tests, right? And that's where the risk gap is much bigger as well. And to sum up, what I have been talking about right now was first, subjective testability, meaning how easy or hard it is to test a given piece of technology for a given person or a given team. Later on, project-related testability, meaning how do we manage the project? Does the project team have all the accesses they need, all the tools they need? Value-related testability. Do you understand the value of the software you are testing? Do you understand the value of a given feature? I mean, someone pays for that stuff, right? So I assume they want to have some value from it. Intrinsic testability, so context is very important, but we cannot forget about the code itself, and the code needs to be testable as well. And epistemic testability, meaning how much of quality standards do we have in our application. And that's all sums up to this term of practical testability that James Bach came up with. That's a nice article by him. And that's the key thing I wanted to share with you today. The last item, there's such a thing also as a testability paradox. So if you have an application that's highly testable, you might be tempted to execute much more tests, right? So I would like to highlight it's also important to know when to end tests and what is out of scope of your testing, right? If you have highly testable application, it doesn't mean you need to test all the scenarios there are in the application, right? And what I would like to leave you with today is a call for action. Think about all of those areas, there are 5, and select maybe one, and now think about the project you are working on right now. And try to find only one improvement in your project related to any of those areas. And I guarantee that if you try to fix that, maybe try to learn what your application is actually, why it's valuable, or maybe try to upskill yourself, or maybe try to work with developers on the code base. I guarantee that it will benefit in the future, and you will find that it's a highly useful framework to be used with your project team. Thank you very much for listening to my talk.
Really interesting speech. Any questions?
You can ask also questions in Russian. I can translate.
Hello. I want to ask how to assess the testability of some feature or program. Can we have all these levels on one? Is it reachable?
I think you can always improve, so it's not like you ever gain this highest level of testability. There are always items to be improved. There are some frameworks to evaluate the intrinsic testability.
But is it necessary?
I think not. The most important thing, in my opinion, is to look for improvement and continuously improve.
And then other and other.
Yeah, one at once, and then another.
All right, thanks.
Какого-нибудь вопроса? Окей.
Каждый из описанных этапов требует сколько-то времени. Вот какой из этапов, на ваш взгляд, наименее затратный, который будет самый короткий? Какой самый затратный?
Okay, so I think it depends on the phase of the project you are working on, of course. But the low-hanging fruit that you could grab immediately, in my opinion, would be the business values or the value related to stability, because pretty often it's just a 10-minute meeting with someone to understand what is the value of your project, why are you actually developing this piece of software. And the hardest one, that's the one that I think is supposed to be a topic of a separate presentation. It's the intrinsic testability of the code itself. I hope that answers your question.
So we have no time for questions. Let's say thank you.